Scenario one is the mistake. And we're going to be running about 45-ish minutes, so we're running a little ahead, which is good. That's because I talk very fast. All right, so here's the scenario. An employee at your company has downloaded an attachment and recognized too late that the email was most likely fraudulent. Computers have begun to become unresponsive. A ransom banner is displaying on some of them, asking for $1,000 in payment to Bitcoin to unlock your devices. Critical business functions cannot be accessed or completed. So this has all happened in a short amount of time. You just showed up at work and this is all happening right now. And so my question is, what is the first step? What is the first thing you do if this is what's happening? The answers to what is your first thing predominantly was shut it down and quarantine, okay? That's not a terrible idea if I'm being honest. A good thing is disconnect from the internet too. But one thing I wanted to add to this, who's the first person you're calling? IT, okay? For those of you who don't have IT departments, because the answer was IT, just so everyone heard, first person they're calling is IT. Do you have a third-party provider you're calling? Do you have a dedicated number for emergencies? Some of them offer that. Do you have account representatives that you can get response in? So let's talk about that. So now the question for the room, and I would hope more people get engaged are, so this happens, you've called IT, IT says, we're looking at it. What's your first big concern? So IT is now going to take a little bit of time to figure out what's going on. As a business owner, as a small business owner, what's your immediate concern now? Because you don't know how long it's going to be, and the IT is going to do their IT stuff. So now you're left waiting for an answer. So what can you do? Go over the security plan. Hopefully it was already in place. So for the sake of the answer, we'll say it was. You have a disaster recovery plan, okay? So you're going to begin to work through that plan, and that's a good answer. Now, I will add the caveat. Plans always survive and do very well until you need to implement them. So there is a high likelihood that you're going to begin to call audibles. In the event that you do that, my recommendation is you record every audible. Begin to, as you work through these plans, take notes about what you're doing. Set up a timeline of what you're doing, who's doing what. And so this is the next big piece. Do you know, as we do this, do you know who's in charge of what piece of the plan? Are you beginning to delegate and put people in charge? Because one of the number one questions that always comes up when things go really bad is, who's in charge? So my question then to the room is, all right, so you're beginning to work your security plan. Business operations are interrupted. IT is still figuring out what's going on and how bad this is. Business needs to continue to run. So when it comes to your company, do you have a way to begin to continue to do work? The answer was, hopefully we already have a backup email. So what's a backup email? We'll talk about that. So if you have a company provided email domain through O365 or what have you, let's assume that's down for now. You lose your email domain. Do you have a means to communicate, an official means to communicate with employees? And the answer would be, maybe you don't always have it, but in the very least, you should have a plan to set one up, whether someone's logging into Gmail and real quickly creating like, help, we're on fire at xcompany.com, you know, like you're setting up that Gmail real quick to blast out to clients or more importantly, employees internally at first, I would think. So that's a good start. So as this happens, does anyone want to pay the ransom? Honest question, there's no penalty for this. And there's a reason I bring this up. Because what's the default is we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? Like Arnold, we're gonna say that into the phone. No, the reality is we just sat at a conference and with a bunch of the cybersecurity insurance. And do you know what they said? Most people pay the ransom. Most people pay the ransom. So the question I have is, in the event that this happens to you, and this is the only thing you can do to get back. Now, I am not suggesting that. I just want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting paying the ransom. But I'm just saying, in the event that that's literally the only way to come back up, do you have a means by which to pay the ransom? Do you have insurance that may or may not cover the payout? Do you know the requirements of that insurance in order for them to pay it out? So that's a question. Cybersecurity insurance right now is a little bit of the Wild West, if I'm being honest. It's a very quickly evolving and changing landscape. At that conference, we heard everything from, if they are not doing any of the things that we demand them to do, we will pay nothing, to we don't know exactly with the scenario to scenario. So that's something you want to be aware of. All right, so in this case, the next question is, what is the expectation you would have as a small business owner? What is your, without doing any research, without doing, just off the top of your head, what do you think a reasonable time is for this to come back online? How long do you reasonably think it would take to bring everything back up from a very serious ransomware attack? What is your expectation as a business owner? Even though you have backups, they still have your data, so there's nothing stopping them from publishing it. And that's an important point to bring up. Do you want that stuff released? And what is the consequence of it being released? So here's the problem with this ransomware attack that scares everyone. So on average, there is a number for small businesses. And I'll tell you in a minute. The scope of answers was 2 days, 1 week, to a month, right? So, and when we look at this, we're talking time to restore. So when can you do business functions? And to time it's totally remediated, when this is very well behind us. And I'll tell you the timeline. So think to yourself, though, before we even get into that, how much money is it going to cost you to run your business without this being up and running for a week? How much money are you losing for being out of the game for a week? What's that costing you in labor? And how many gray hairs are you beginning to grow? Okay? So the next question I will address is, with backups, should we need to pay the ransom? It depends. So hopefully you don't pay the ransom. Hopefully I don't want anyone to have to pay the ransom. There's very few things I hate more than cyber criminals, and I hope they make no money and terrible things happen to them always. So no, I don't want them paid. However, I will say, how do you know your backups weren't affected? Because backups are captures of data as it was in a state previous to this. So how long ago was this infection on your machine or in your system? So if you go back a week in backups and you lose all that data that was there for a week to go to get healthy, what if that infection was still there? What if you go back a month? What's that costing you? How are you recovering that business that you did? Those invoices, purchase orders, communications, quotes, things to think about. So I told you I'd tell you the actual time. So on average, a ransomware attack takes 3 days to get back to critical business functions for small businesses, 3 days on average. That's just to be able to do critical business functions. You're out of the game for about 3 days. That's on average. Now it can be much less, it can be much more. So for total time of completion, and what that means is, not only are you doing business, but you feel like you've comfortably gotten yourself to a clean state where you don't have this lingering and you feel like it's behind you, is 6 weeks. 6 weeks before you feel like it's behind you. In my experience, what is the assurance you have if you even pay the ransom that things are going to come back to normal? And so I won't quote my experience because I think that's variable. I will quote the numbers. They say you're about 22%, so it's like just slightly over 1 in 5, that they're not going to return your data. So about 1 in 5. And that seems like, man, that's not so bad. Now you got a 4 out of 5 chance of them turning it on. Sure, but how long until they turn it off again? I mean, you just proved you can be a source of income. So this is why, even if you pay the ransom, even if you have backups and it gets you back right that day, are those backups clean? How do you make sure those backups are clean? And if you pay the ransom, how do you make sure your systems are clean? And how much is it going to cost you to figure those things out? And how much, if you do find elements of that ransomware still on your system, how much are you paying then to go back and scrub it or start it over or refresh or start with a clean build or whatever? And how does that impact your operations? How much time and labor is that going to cost you? So I said earlier, and I lied, and then I corrected myself, I don't like scaring you guys. I do like scaring you, but it's productive scare because I want you in your head thinking about these things as you begin to address these problems. Because what I don't want, though, is you to be paralyzed. And I don't want it to sound like there is no solution, because there are solutions. Prevention, an ounce of prevention is worth everything, but even if it does happen, these are the things you need to plan out and be prepared to deal with. So most IT providers, if you have a ransomware infection, are going to say we're going to go back to our last known good backup, even if it's a month prior, and then we're going to clean wipe and rebuild all the workstations. That's basically more or less where you're going to start. Now we're going to change directions, and we're going to kind of talk about the 3 critical considerations here. And I had earlier combined business continuity and disaster recovery. So we're talking about communicating, mitigating, and diagnosing. Now the diagnosing is probably on the IT providers or your IT department or whatnot. That's probably more their thing. And they might not be able to diagnose exactly what happened. Depending on the severity of the attack and their capabilities, what tools they have available, might not happen. But business continuity is important. And a lot of these things we already talked about. How do we operate business? How do we communicate? Who do we communicate to? How do we engage our employees? Who's in charge is going to be an increasingly important question when things are really bad. People are going to want people to look for. Disaster recovery, time to restoral, get an estimated time to restoral. Stay engaged with any third-party partners or vendors. Data integrity review and data sanitation. This is where we're talking at the end of the game. So after you've come back up and after things are starting to get back to normal, how do you make sure the integrity of that data is right? Are you reviewing some of these records? And what I mean by that is if you had to go back a month in your backups, are you looking at your client data and making sure things are updated correctly based on what has happened? Do you have a means to do that? And do a review and brief of the incident. I really recommend, at least internally to decision makers in the company, you guys sit around a table and talk about what happened and talk about how certain processes ran. Talk about what could have been better, where expectations were or weren't met and exceeded. Take a note of all of that and put it into lessons learned and keep it for yourself. And if you care about any companies you do business with, maybe share it. Because you will learn a lot when things go bad about how quickly you can pivot and operate and what your relationships look like with providers and clients, what their expectations are, what your expectations are, you will learn.